Hey everybody, this is a piece from the compendium Global Anti-Semitism, A Crisis of Modernity. This piece is titled Post-War Anti-Semitism, Germany's Foreign Policy Toward Egypt by Ulricke Becker. It says that Ulricke Becker is, at least at the time of this publication, was a doctoral scholar at the University of Stuttgart, a former graduate fellow at the YISA, Yale University. So here we go. Introduction. After 1948, every country that was diplomatically involved in the Middle East conflict was confronted with Arab hostility toward Israel and was therefore challenged with the task of reacting to such animosity. A new anti-Semitism emerged that was directed against the very existence of a Jewish state. This gives rise to several important questions. How did diplomats react to Arab animosity toward Israel? Did Arab anti-Semitism play a role in the conceptions of foreign policy? If so, was the topic actually brought up with Arab states? Did diplomats do anything to confront this problem? Footnote. For the sake of clarity, Arab hostility toward Israel is not necessarily anti-Semitic. However, there is a point when political enmity opposing Zionism crosses over into anti-Semitism. For example, when there is a positive reference to Nazi anti-Semitism, or when the acceptance and dissemination of conspiracy theories like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is involved. Holocaust denial is also an important aspect of this new anti-Semitism. While these questions emerged for all diplomats, end footnote. While these questions emerged for all diplomats, German diplomats had to address more specific concerns, especially in Egypt, where they were confronted with the ramifications of German anti-Semitic propaganda and politics, which many of them had personally designed and promoted only a few years earlier. The Middle East policy of the Nazis had been anti-British in design and anti-Semitic in essence. Especially during the second half of World War II, Germany had employed considerable efforts to incite Arabs to fight against Germany's enemies via radio propaganda with a distinctly anti-Semitic, anti-British, and anti-American character, as Jeffrey Herf convincingly describes in his illuminating book on this subject. Footnote. Jeffrey Herf, Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World, 2009. See also Matthias Kunzel's, that's something in German. I'm not going to read that. End footnote. The Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, was a close ally of the Nazis and had played a major role in programming propaganda broadcast into the Arab world. Books on this subject are the Mufti Joseph Boris Schechtman, The Mufti and the Fuhrer, The Rise and Fall of Haj Amin al-Husseini, and Zvi Alpelig, the Grand Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, founder of the Palestinian National Movement, and Matthias Kunzel, Jihad and Jew Hatred, Islamism, Nazism, and the Roots of 9/11. End footnote. In the post-war years, the Mufti, although he had been involved in war crimes, was a figure of considerable political influence in Egypt, and his Nazi-like anti-Semitism affected the Palestinian National Movement and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Then there was the circle of young officers, including Abdel Nasser and Anwar al-Sadat. In July 1952, Nasser and Sadat seized power in Egypt in a military coup d'etat. During World War II, both of them had collaborated with the Germans as guerrilla fighters. Footnote, that's something in a foreign language that I can't read. As politicians, Nasser and Sadat both recommended the Protocols of the Elders of Zion as an important source of information on the nature of Israel and the Jewish people. Nasser's brother, Saki Don Nasir, personally edited an Arabic translation of the protocols, and under Nasser's presidency in the 1950s, one of the most radical anti-Semitic publicists of the Third Reich, Johann von Leers, who had been an open advocate of Jewish genocide, was employed in the Egyptian propaganda ministry. Johann von Leers was in charge of propaganda against Israel and organized lectures for Egyptian officials. Bernard Lewis is one of many historians who have pointed out how German National Socialism was openly praised in post-war Egypt. This was the political climate faced by German diplomats in Egypt at the beginning of the 1950s. See Bernard Lewis's Semites and Anti-Semites, 1986. In this article, I'll focus on two questions. The first question concerns whether German foreign policy sent signals to the Arab world that were understood as support for Arab hostility toward Israel. The most important examples of this are Germany's refusal to establish diplomatic relations with Israel until 1965, and the support provided to Egypt's military and arms industry by German experts. The second question concerns whether there was a transfer of ideas from the Nazi era to the post-war period. In this context, I will examine perceptions of Zionism and how decisions that helped to legitimize the Jewish state were connected to the Nazi. I will examine perceptions of Zionism and how decisions that helped to delegitimize the Jewish state were connected to the Nazi heritage. My research, therefore, also touches on the issue of the German political elite's relationship with its Nazi past. Section 2. The impact of German foreign policy on Arab hostility toward Israel. Usually the historiography of German-Arab relations begins in 1952. In October of 1952, Günter Pawelka, it just says he was a diplomat. There's nothing there for him. The first West German ambassador arrived in Cairo, but his arrival was not the first chapter in German-Egyptian relations after World War II. Another group of Germans had arrived 2 years earlier, led by Dr. Wilhelm Voss, a former high-ranking SS officer. Voss had been one of Nazi Germany's leading managers. In 1937, Wilhelm Voss was appointed general manager of the Reichswerke, Hermann Göring. During World War II, Wilhelm Voss also headed several large armaments conglomerates, mainly in German-occupied Czechoslovakia. Czech companies and trusts were bought or dispossessed and integrated into Nazi conglomerates, two of which were led by Voss, Skoda and Brunner Waffenfabrik. The Göring-Werke employed more than 1.8 million forced laborers, POWs, and concentration camp prisoners. In Voss's area of operations, at least 18,000 people died of brutal abuse, a consequence of the murderous violence of the SS police state that was imported into the war economy, and the concept of, quote, annihilation through work, end quote, which was first implemented in the Reichswerke. From Wikipedia. The Reichswerke Hermann Göring. Reichswerke Hermann Göring was an industrial conglomerate in Nazi Germany from 1937 until 1945. The Reichswerke Hermann Göring was established to extract and process domestic iron ores from Salzgitter that was deemed uneconomical by the privately held steel mills. The state-owned Reichswerke was seen as a vehicle of hastening growth in ore mining and steel output regardless of private capitalist plans and opinions, which ran in alignment to Adolf Hitler's strategic and economic vision. In November 1937, Reichsminister of Aviation Hermann Göring obtained unchecked access to state financing and launched a chain of mergers, diversifying into military industries with the absorption of the Rheinmetall. Göring himself supervised the Reichswerke but did not own it in any sense, and did not make personal profit from it directly, although at times he withdrew cash for personal expenses. After the Anschluss, the Reichswerke absorbed Austrian heavy industries, including those owned by private German investors. The cluster of steel mills and supporting companies in Linz became its most important asset. Nazi leadership regarded captured assets as the property of the state and were not willing to share the spoils with American businesses. After the German occupation of Czechoslovakia, the Reichswerke absorbed between 50 and 60% of Czech heavy industries. The pattern was repeated in occupied Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. The Reichswerke operated captured assets as far from its base as Liepaja in Latvia and Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. It provided 1/8 of German steel output during the Second World War and created a Nazi-controlled military complex that was independent of private interests. By the end of 1941, the Reichswerke became the largest company in Europe, and probably in the whole world, with a capital of 2.4 billion RM. I don't know what that fucking means. And about Reichsmarks, I guess. Reichsmarks, that's probably what it means. Is that what it means? Reichsmark. Okay. And about a 500,000 workers. In 1942, the Reichswerke's inefficient corporate structure was reduced in size. The Reichswerke's operations and munitions assets were integrated into the Ministry of Armaments. The mining and steel corps of the Reichswerke continued operation under Göring's supervision until the end of the war, albeit at a loss. The conglomerate was dismembered by the Allies in 1944 to 45, but the Salzgitter plant continued operations as Reichswerke until 1953. The Reichswerke logo, which resembled Göring's coat of arms, remained in use by Peine and Salzgitter until the middle of the 1980s. Okay, that was a little bit of a long entry, but I think it was informative. So, back to the text. In Voss's area of operations, at least 18,000 people died of brutal abuse, a consequence of the murderous violence of the SS police state that was imported into the war economy, and the concept of, quote, annihilation through work, end quote, which was first implemented at the Reichswerke. Voss was also a member of the so-called Circle of Friends of Heinrich Himmler, the quote, Circle of Friends of Heinrich Himmler, end quote, until 1935, quote, Circle of Friends of the Reichsführer SS, end quote, a group of about 40 leading SS officers, Nazis, and German industrialists who advised the Nazi Party on economic matters and supported the party financially. Voss thus belonged to the elite circles of the Nazi regime. Footnote. It's from the Digest of Protocols of Interrogation by Dr. Wilhelm Voss by Mr. Barr in Nuremberg on December 11th, 1946, December 20th, 1946, a bunch of other dates. Back to the text. Foss arrived in Egypt at the end of 1950 after spending time in the American detention camp under house arrest in Germany for about 5 years. He was stationed in the Ministry of War, where he laid the foundations for the Egyptian arms industry. He also brought several former generals and officers of the German armed forces to Egypt. This group of advisors, who served from 1951 to 1958, was comprised of up to 60 German officers. Wilhelm Farnbacher, a former general, headed the subgroup that was located within the Egyptian military. Wikipedia says Wilhelm Farnbacher, who lived from 1888 to 1970, was a general in the Wehrmacht of Nazi Germany during World War II who commanded several corps, including the 7th Corps, the 25th Corps, and I don't know what the Roman numerals. I'm not sure what L means, so if you know what L means, tell me in the comments if you're listening. Fighting on both the Eastern Front and Western Front. Farnbacher joined the Bavarian Army on the 18th of July 1907 and fought throughout the First World War. After the war, Farnbacher joined the Reichswehr, where he was rapidly promoted to command of the 5th Infantry Division. Farnbacher led the 5th Infantry Division in Poland and France before being promoted to command the 7th Army Corps, which he led during Operation Barbarossa. In 1942, Farnbacher gained command of the 25th Corps in northern France, and after the Allied invasion of France, commanded the German forces holding the Lorient Fortress, surrendering only after the unconditional surrender of Germany. After World War II, Farnbacher was an advisor to the Egyptian army from 1951 to 1958. He died in 1970. Okay, so back to the text. Wilhelm Farnbacher, a former general, headed the subgroup that was located within the Egyptian army. Farnbacher's office was next to the office of the Egyptian chief of staff, and they worked closely together. Footnote. For information on Wilhelm Farnbacher, see his papers. It's a file. It's an archive. In 1941, Farnbacher was commanded general of the 7th Battalion that was involved in the war against Russia. From 1942 to 1945, he was a commanding general in Brittany and Normandy, France. Although the advisors stressed that their job was back to the text. Although the advisors stressed that their job was purely of a consultative nature, and that they did not hold command positions, they were clearly involved in military preparations. Beyond documents concerning consultations on operative, strategic, and tactical questions, I've also found plans for military operations against Israel in Farnbacher's papers. Footnote. Oskar Munzel, a member of the German military experts group, announced in 1953 that the Egyptian army was primarily preparing for a war with Israel. End footnote. The group came to Egypt when King Farouk was still in power. Farouk I of Egypt lived from 1920 to 1965 and was the 10th ruler of Egypt under the Muhammad Ali dynasty and the penultimate king of Egypt and the Sudan, succeeding his father Fuad I in 1906 and reigning until his overthrow in a military coup in 1952. Farouk's full title was His Majesty Farouk I, by the grace of God, King of Egypt and the Sudan, end quote. As king, Farouk was known for his extravagant playboy lifestyle. While initially popular, Farouk reputation eroded due to the corruption and incompetence of his government. Farouk was overthrown in the 1952 coup d'etat and forced to abdicate in favor of his infant son, Ahmed Fuad, who succeeded him as Fuad II. Farouk died in exile in Italy in 1965. Farouk's sister, Prince Fawzia bint Fuad, was the first wife and consort of the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Okay, so back to the text. The group came to Egypt when King Farouk was still in power. However, Foss and Farnbacher kept their positions after the coup against Farouk in July 1952. According to CIA sources, Farnbacher helped the, quote, free officers, end quote, the circle around Nasser and Naguib to prepare a plan for the army's internal control of Cairo and in case there would be a revolution. Who's Naguib? Mohammed Naguib lived from 1901 to 1984, also known as Muhammad Naguib, was an Egyptian military officer and revolutionary who, along with Gamal Abdel Nasser, was one of the two principal leaders of the Free Officers Movement of 1952 that toppled the monarchy of Egypt and the Sudan, including modern-day South Sudan, leading to the establishment of the Republic of Egypt and the independence of Sudan and eventually South Sudan in 2010. The distinguished and decorated general who was wounded in actions in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Mohammed Naguib, became the leader of the Free Officers Movement of nationalist army officers opposed to the continued presence of British troops in Egypt and Sudan, and the corruption and incompetence of King Farouk. Following the toppling of Farouk in July 1952, Naguib went on to serve as the head of the Revolutionary Command Council, the Prime Minister and first President of Egypt, successfully negotiating the independence of Sudan, hitherto a condominium of Egypt and the United Kingdom, and the withdrawal of all British military personnel from Egypt. Mohammed Naguib's tenure as president came to an end in November 1954 due to disagreements with other members of the Free Officers, particularly with Nasser, who forced him to resign and succeeded him as president. As Egypt had been ruled by various other empires in history, and during times of independence it was usually ruled by non-ethnically Egyptian rulers such as Albanian dynasty of Muhammad Ali and the Greek dynasty of Cleopatra, Mohammed Naguib is commonly referred to as the first Egyptian ruler of Egypt in over 2,500 years. So back to the text. According to CIA sources, Farnbacher helped the, quote, free officers, end quote, the circle around Nasser and Naguib to prepare a plan for the army's internal control in Cairo in case there would be a revolution. Foss accompanied Egyptian officials on their trips to Germany and served as an intermediary to German industrial circles. Foss also maintained contacts with West German officials in the Foreign Office, the Trade Ministry, the Chancellery, and the Ministry of Defense, which was then in process of being set up. Some observers considered his... the scrolling down is not working right. His influence in Cairo and Germany to be higher than that of Germany's official ambassador, Günther Pavelka, and rumors spread in intelligence circles that Foss would soon become an official West German representative. The position of Günther Pavelka, the first official German ambassador to Egypt, was therefore not easy. The foreign ministry expected Günther Pavelka to cooperate with Foss and while the two got along well in the beginning, conflicts began to emerge in April 1953 when Pavelka was concerned that Foss was acting against German interests. One claim was that he was cooperating with the communists, another that he maintained close contacts with the Arab and German circles around Mufti Amin al-Husseini and German businessman Joachim, sorry, I forget how to say that, Joachim Herzlitt. I'm not seeing anything for Joachim Herzlitt, a committed and high-ranking Nazi who worked for the Reich Ministry of Economic Affairs. Herzlitt was the leading force behind a campaign in the Arab states against the German compensation payments to Israel. The Federal Republic committed itself to supply goods in the amount of Deutschmarks 3.45 billion to Israel and to pay Deutschmarks 450 million to the Jewish Claims Conference. The Claims Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, or Claims Conference, represented the world's Jews in negotiating for compensation and restitution for victims of Nazi persecution and their heirs. According to Section 213 of the Property Law of Germany, the Claims Conference is a legal successor with respect to the claims not filed on time by Jewish persons. This fact was reasserted in decisions of some lawsuits which attempted to redefine the Claims Conference as a, quote, trustee, end quote, of these assets. These lawsuits were dismissed. The Claims Conference administers compensation funds, recovers unclaimed Jewish property, and allocates funds to institutions that provide social welfare services to Holocaust survivors and preserve the memory and lessons of the Holocaust. Julius Berman, who led the organization as chairman of the board and currently president, has led the organization as chairman of the board and currently as president as of 2020. So that's what the Jewish Claims Conference is. In the end, it was Pavelka who decided to resign and leave Egypt in 1954 after he refused to cooperate with Foss, while the former SS man remained in his position. But Foss's influence also faded, particularly after Prime Minister Winston Churchill publicly criticized the activities of ex-Nazis working as military advisors in May 1953 and accused them of training Egyptian guerrilla units that attacked British troops stationed in the Suez Canal zone. The German government then sent an official to Cairo who met with the advisors and gave them strict guidelines. The group was separated into two different units and lost a great deal of its influence with the Egyptian government around 1954. In spite of the British criticism, the above-mentioned German official highly valued the work of the Germans in Egypt, which he described as a, quote, positive political fact, end quote, for Germany. He recommended exerting influence on the group and giving them a, quote, feeling of official comradely support, end quote. I believe that in utilizing these contacts, the German government also sent a political message to the Egyptian government, signaling that former SS men were accepted mediators and negotiators, not to mention the fact that their function was to assist Egypt in its war against Israel. Section 3. The transfer of ideas from the Nazi era to the post-war period. This brings me to my second point, the question whether there was a transfer of ideas from the Nazi era to the post-war period. I want to illustrate the question by focusing on the case of one diplomat Wilhelm, one diplomat, Wilhelm Melchers, and it doesn't really say anything on Wikipedia. Wilhelm Melchers was employed in the German Foreign Office from 1925. Wilhelm Melchers was appointed director of the Near East Department in December 1939 and held this position until the end of the war. Footnote: from 1931 to 1934, Wilhelm Melchers served in the Near East Department under the leadership of Fritz Grobe. From 1935 to 1937, Wilhelm Melchers worked at the embassy in Tehran, and from February 1938 to September 1939, Wilhelm Melchers held the position of consul in Haifa. Between 1951 and 1954, Kurt Munzel worked as Melchers' deputy. During the Nazi period, Munzel was the head of the radio department and responsible for the Nazi propaganda for the Arab world. Thus, two diplomats who had worked on anti-Semitic incitement were now responsible for reports and assessments on Israel and the Near East conflict in the Foreign Office. Melchers' successors as head of the Near East Department, Hermann Voigt, had also been in the service of the Foreign Office since 1921. For a general overview of the staff of the Foreign Office, see Hans-Jürgen Duscher. Some book in German, and books by Eckhard Konze, Norbert Frey, Peter Hayes, and Moshe Zimmerman. End footnote. Jeffrey Herf describes how he was, Wilhelm Melchers, was involved in developing anti-Semitic propaganda for the Arab world. After the war from 1951 to 1953, Melchers once again headed the Near East Department. Footnote. Oh, it's just a citation of Herf. Wilhelm Melchers thus wielded considerable influence over Germany's Near East policy and the reestablishment of West Germany's relations with Arab countries. From 1953 until 1957, Wilhelm Melchers was the head of the German embassy in Baghdad. During this time, Melchers was also in charge of the legation in Jordan and for reports on Israel. The way in which an anti-Semitic conception of Zionism influenced Melchers' assessment of the Near East conflict after the war is evident from some of his reports. In 1955, Wilhelm Melchers sent a report from Baghdad analyzing Israel's policies in which he described the Jewish state as being of a, quote, expansionist nature, end quote. Israel in its present form, he argued, would establish a, quote, bridgehead, end quote, providing the basis for future, quote, generous expansion, end quote. A, quote, uncompromising attitude, end quote, on the Arab side was therefore understandable and a peaceful solution to the conflict impossible. The Arabs would, quote, feel safe only after the last Jew had left Palestine, end quote. This report reveals how deeply Melchers' thoughts were still influenced by Nazi conceptions. The idea that the Jews were intending to combine Palestine with Syria and Transjordan into a, quote, huge Jewish home, end quote, had been among the core ideas of Nazi propaganda for the Arab world, as well as predictions concerning the murderous policies of the Jews toward the Arabs in Palestine and elsewhere. Melcher's conclusion was that it was impossible for Arab countries to tolerate even a small Jewish minority on Palestinian soil, reveals his anti-Jewish worldview. In what way did this worldview affect West Germany's foreign policy? The most controversial figures in German post-war Middle East policy concerned the character of German relations with Israel. After the debate on compensation payments in 1952, the main question was whether Germany should establish diplomatic relations with the Jewish state. The debate cannot be explored in detail here, however. The result was that Germany refused to establish diplomatic ties with Israel until 1965. That's interesting. Footnote. It is typical of the German context that politicians did not openly announce this policy. In negotiations with Israeli intermediaries, German politicians instead stressed that they were willing to establish relations at a later date. End footnote. The decision in favor of this policy was made in 1956 when a secret conference of German ambassadors who represented Germany in Middle Eastern states took place in Istanbul. The German ambassadors attending the conference unanimously opposed the establishment of diplomatic relations with Israel, fearing protests from Arab countries, and as a consequence, Arab diplomatic recognition of the German Democratic Republic. They even voted against the establishment of a trade mission, which was subsequently cancelled despite prior promises. Wilhelm Melcher was one of the first and most outspoken advocates in this debate. Wilhelm Melcher's reasons are expressed in a letter that he sent to the German Foreign Office in July 1955. In this letter, Wilhelm Melcher painted a grim picture of what would happen should Germany establish diplomatic relations with Israel. Quote, the establishment of diplomatic relations with Israel would cause a storm of outrage in Arab countries and would inflict serious damage to our political, economic, and cultural interests. It would definitely unsettle the German-Arab friendship, and due to the Arab mentality, would turn friendship into hate because the Arab countries would not forgive the betrayal of a good friend. End quote. Wilhelm Melcher. Melcher here refers to a crucial point. Arab diplomats were convinced that Germany had acted under foreign pressure when it signed the Luxembourg Treaty, which regulated the compensation payments to Israel. After Germany regained its sovereignty in 1955, the Arab world expected the German government to refrain from any step in favor of Israel. It is clear that Wilhelm Melcher was well aware of the anti-Israel component of the so-called German-Arab friendship. Moreover, Wilhelm Melcher was clearly unwilling to give up the advantages he expected to obtain from Germany's Nazi legacy. The idea that Germany had been forced to sign the Luxembourg Treaty was indeed very widespread in the Arab world. Although this was not true, it is correct that the compensation payments were not very popular in Germany or among German politicians. Inside the Foreign Office in West Germany, however, overt Nazi-like anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism was taboo. Germany's main aim in foreign policy was to be integrated economically and strategically in the Western Alliance. It was crucial to establish a new image of a democratic society and to demonstrate a new beginning. As the U.S. High Commissioner John McCloy observed, Konrad Adenauer, is it Konrad? I think it's Konrad. Adenauer, who was like the first, or I don't know, the first main leader, I guess, of the Federal Republic, West Germany. Let me restart. The U.S. High Commissioner John McCloy observed, Adenauer understood that, quote, the way Germany acts towards the Jews in the future will be the acid test of German democracy, end quote. There's a footnote here that I missed. German diplomats feared that German diplomats feared that Germany would consequently lose important economic contracts as well as Arab support at the United Nations, and that Arab states would support the East German socialist state instead. In addition, the Federal Republic would face heavy losses in the cultural arena. The future of German schools in the Arab world would also be in trouble. At the conference in Istanbul, Melchers added another argument. The lives of German embassy staff and members of the German colonies would no longer be safe. End footnote. Back to the text. Consequently, Adenauer often stressed that the compensation payments to Israel that he announced in September 1951 were a, quote, necessity, end quote, to regain credibility in the Western world in order to obtain credit in business contracts. In retrospect, the moral side of the question was not sufficiently emphasized. Historian Wage Atek. Let's see if there's anything. Doesn't seem like there's anything. Seems like they're a professor at the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung. So, historian Wage Atek quotes Egyptian sources revealing that Adenauer personally stayed in front of an Arab delegation that the issue of reparations to Israel had been regulated in accordance with the wishes of the United States. Under Secretary of State Hallstein reportedly said to the Egyptian Consul General in Frankfurt, quote, it is not possible not to sign the agreement. Israel, through the Jewish magnifying glass in America and England, is stronger than one assumes. It is impossible for the federal government to take counteraction, end quote. I want to repeat that. Under Secretary of State Hallstein reportedly said to the Egyptian Consul General in Frankfurt, quote, it is not possible not to sign the agreement. Israel, through the Jewish magnifying glass in America and England, is stronger than one assumes. It is impossible for the federal government to take counteraction, end quote. In those statements, the anti-Semitic stereotype of Jewish power was given a new lease of life. It is therefore not surprising that many Arab politicians and journalists were under the impression that anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli views still prevailed in Germany, and that the German government would have supported the Arab side in the conflict if it had been completely sovereign. The above statement is not documented in German protocols of meetings between Hallstein and the Egyptian representatives. According to German sources, Hallstein explained on the one hand that the decision to sign the Luxembourg Treaty originated from the desire of the German people to, quote, wipe away, end quote, the, quote, blemish, end quote, on the German honor resulting from the crimes against the Jews. On the other hand, he emphasized that Germany was not able to ratify the agreement as this would be, quote, suicide, end quote. Melchers made a similar argument in a meeting with the King of Jordan. He wired to Bonn that he had informed King Hussein that, quote, the Arabs could not expect Germany to commit suicide only to save their Arab friends from harm, end quote. Hussein of Jordan, this is from Wikipedia, Hussein bin Talal, who lived from 1935 to 1999 and was king of Jordan from the 11th of August 1952 until his death in 1999, as a member of the Hashemite dynasty, the royal family of Jordan since 1921. Hussein was a 40th generation direct descendant of the Islamic prophet Muhammad. Hussein was born in Amman as the eldest child of Talal bin Abdullah and Sain al-Sharaf bint Jamil. Talal was then the heir to his father, King Abdullah I. Hussein began his schooling in Amman, continuing Hussein's education abroad. After Talal became king in 1951, Hussein was named heir apparent. The Jordanian parliament forced Talal to abdicate a year later due to his illness, and a regency council was appointed until Hussein came of age. Hussein was enthroned at the age of 17 on the 2nd of May 1953. Hussein was married 4 separate times and fathered 11 children. Hussein, a constitutional monarch with wide legislative powers, started his rule with what was termed a, quote, liberal experiment, end quote, allowing in 1956 the foundation of the only democratically elected government in Jordan's history. A few months into the experiment, Hussein forced the leftist government to resign, declaring martial law and banning political parties. Jordan fought 3 wars with Israel under Hussein, including the 1967 Six-Day War, which ended in Jordan's loss of the West Bank in 1970. Hussein expelled Palestinian fighters from Jordan after they had threatened the country's security in what became known as Black September. The king renounced Jordan's ties to the West Bank in 1988 after the Palestinian Liberation Organization was recognized internationally as the sole representative of the Palestinians. King Hussein lifted martial law and reintroduced elections in 1989 when riots over price hikes spread in southern Jordan. In 1994, Hussein became the second Arab head of state to sign a peace treaty with Israel. At the time of Hussein's accession in 1953, Jordan was a young nation and controlled the West Bank. The country had few natural resources and a large Palestinian refugee population as a result of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Hussein led this country through 4 turbulent decades of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Cold War, successively balancing pressures from Arab nationalists, Islamists, the Soviet Union, Western countries, and Israel, transforming Jordan by the end of his 46-year reign into a stable modern state. After 1967, After 1967, Hussein engaged in efforts to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Hussein acted as a conciliatory intermediate between various Middle Eastern rivals and came to be seen as the region's peacemaker. Hussein was revered for pardoning political dissidents and opponents and giving them senior posts in the government. Hussein, who survived dozens of assassination attempts and plots to overthrow him, was the region's longest reigning leader. Hussein died at the age of 63 from cancer in 1999 and was succeeded by his eldest son, Abdullah II. So that's King Hussein. So back to the text. Melchers wired to Bonn that he had informed King Hussein that, quote, the Arabs could not expect Germany to commit suicide only to save their Arab friends from harm, ... end quote. Moreover, Chancellor Adenauer argued that, quote, the power of the Jews, particularly in America, end quote, was one of the most important reasons for Adenauer to seek reconciliation with the Jewish people. That's charming. Conclusion. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, so conclusion. In these and similar statements, German politicians and diplomats highlighted that they had not been completely free in their decisions. It is therefore not surprising that German diplomats failed to convey the message of a new non-anti-Semitic Germany to the Arab states until 1965. This failure became obvious in a report sent to Bonn from the German embassy in Cairo in summer of 1964. The report stated that the Egyptian government was convinced of the, quote, existence of another real national Germany, end quote, that was hiding behind the official one. Nasser perceived the official Germany to be under pressure from Zionist circles and tried to encourage the, quote, hidden Germany, end quote, to emerge for closer cooperation with Egypt. Footnote: Report on National Socialists and German Scientists in Egypt, undated, author unknown. This report was written by a journalist who was in close contact with the embassy and clearly had access to embassy files. End footnote. This analysis was made after President Nasser gave an exclusive interview to Deutsche National und Soldatenzeitung, a radical right-wing This PDF is not cooperative in the scrolling department. Radical right-wing German journal circulating in Nazi circles in May 1964. In this interview, Nasser described the Holocaust as a, quote, myth, end quote, and announced that Egypt would crush Israel. During the 1950s and early 1960s, German diplomats in Arab countries were aware of the fact that they enjoyed considerable advantages in Arab countries compared to other Western states because of their refusal to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. In the words of von Waldau, a legation counselor at the German embassy in Baghdad, quote, there has been a strong argument in favor of the Federal Republic. The fact that Germany, in contrast to other Western democracy, has no diplomatic relations with the State of Israel. If we lose this argument in the future, the only defensive weapon we possess will be beaten out of our hands, end quote. Voices like these dominated the debate in the Foreign Office at that time. Antisemitism in the Arab states was not criticized by German diplomats, nor was Holocaust denial. Former high-ranking German Nazis were accepted as interlocutors in Egypt. A highly ambivalent policy toward Israel added to the delegitimization of the Jewish state. The episodes described in this article show how strongly anti-Semitism and complicity with Arab hostility toward Israel informed Germany's foreign policy in the post-war years. Thanks for listening to that. I appreciate it. That's the end. Thank you for listening.